Giving the call to the member for Bowman.
Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. And it's a delight to join this very impassioned and important debate about the cashless welfare card. And the case from the opposition is very much that this policy is racist, punitive, shameful and costly. And I'll try and address those 4 key points, but I'll really focus on the evidence, because certainly when, and many of us, if not all of us, have visited Indigenous communities, you'll always hear both sides of the cashless welfare card debate, and so it's inevitable that we'll be listening to the voices that suit our particular line of reasoning, and that's only natural. But I think it's very important that all of us don't just fly in like seagulls and spend a day and talk to our chosen spokespeople. I've got a particular interest speaking to members in this chamber who've lived in a remote Indigenous community, paid the rates, paid the rent, lived locally and seen it for themselves. And I'm not one who's done that. But in 1993 and 94, in that very, very difficult time pre-welfare controls and welfare cards, I was spending a lot of time in Lajamanu, a semi-desert Warlpiri community of Northern Territory. And that work in 93, 94 gave me the time to spend night after night and week after week in this community and see the ravages of petrol sniffing at the time. And the Warlpiri people, speaking their language, would meet in large groups and mourn the inability of traditional Indigenous structures to deal with petrol and how they could communicate with the youth that they felt they'd lost. And these kinds of problems, when you've seen them firsthand, I couldn't understand the Warlpiri conversations except the word petrol sniffing, because they didn't have a word for the very thing that a traditional culture was attempting to control and deal with. The card, of course, is not perfect. The card is in many ways the best way that a Western system can deal with its own limitations, which is the payment of cash as a form of income replacement. Even the payment of cash itself creates problems, which this debate seems to have almost neglected, because before the card we paid cash and we've had terrible problems. Were I to be introducing cash, I'd make all these same arguments about cash. So this is a relative debate about the change between payment of cash and the introduction of a portion of that payment not being cash. And it's a very, very subtle argument that I feel has been lost. There's nothing racist about the policy. It's true that some of these social malaise are higher in Indigenous communities, and it's true that we went first to the parts of this great nation where these concerns were greatest. But we got Indigenous community support for it, and the first thing we said was this rule, this card, will apply to everyone here, not just Indigenous Australians. And it's a great disappointment for me that the Labor Party continues to muddy the waters there. It is true it has been introduced in areas of predominant Indigenous population. It was done so with community agreement, and it applied to every Australian. And it's a shame that that gets liquid papered away. Now, the elements of punitive and shame around these cards are very hard to avoid. It's quite right that there can be significant shame about being placed on a card, and I don't deny that. There's significant stress and trauma about attending or sitting a NAPLAN test. I can't help that either. But it is a shame if elected representatives kick that shame along, promote it and fan the flames of shame by continuing to vocalise it. I can appreciate some people will not like a government policy, but to be honest, everything has been done in this policy to make it applicable and acceptable. And honestly, we are a culture, both cultures, that now live on credit cards, and we live with cashless payments, whether it comes from an employer or the government. I mean, my entire life is cashless now, and to simply claim and poke people and say your card's a different colour, I think is to, again, overly aggravate this debate in a negative way. We could see self-evidently that gambling and alcohol was causing a problem, and it's not that we say nothing else works. To the members of the other side, I say the pedal is on the floor with every other program money can afford, and we still can't fix the problem. I think it's a very high bar to say, you know what, you introduced the card and the problems didn't go away. I mean, that's not a failure of the card any more than it's a failure of the social worker who's delivering social services or the OT who's delivering occupational therapy services. They don't fail because the problem wasn't fixed. This is one of a range in this causal web of dysfunction that exists in every corner of Australia, black and white and everything in between, and we need to work in every corner to do our very, very best. And the card is just one extra element of it. It deserves to be studied, deserves to be evaluated, deserves to be excoriated if people find that that in fact is what's happening. But in reality, this is one intervention sitting alongside a range of other reforms, and I think the government's done a good job over time to technologically make this card almost indistinguishable from a credit card. I mean, you'd need a PhD, wouldn't you, in something to be able to work out the difference when you're using those two cards, cashless debit card or a credit card, going through a tiny supermarket in your local store. And let's be honest here, come on, where it's been introduced, virtually everyone's on the card in these communities. And we've now moved to Bundaberg and doing a mainstream trial. And I think it's repugnant to say in Bundaberg that 95% of the people on the card are white and this is racist against whites, because that's the absolute counter-argument to what's being put to us today. It's nothing to do with colour of your skin. Thank you so much. The member for Petrie standing up and saying this has got nothing to do with race. This is a great country that's trying to pull itself together and close gaps, and it's wrong to characterise this card in such a way. Look, there's been multiple independent evaluations. Not all of them have been positive. We accept that. But what I want to do is just go through the incontrovertible evidence that there is less drinking reported, less drugs reported, and less gambling. And that was the goal of the card. It didn't say that those things would go away with a card. Anyone who's lived in a community would understand it doesn't go away because we're only quarantining 80% anyway. So there's still 20% there. I'm speaking for Australians in every other corner of this country who would say it's only reasonable that 80% of a taxpayer transfer to someone on income replacement should be spent on their kids, on food and on basic household expenses. 20% is still there for all the gambling and alcohol that you want. That point again seems lost on the Labor Party. So today I come into this great place to say that I stand for the 25% of people in these areas who report they drink less alcohol. And none say, or very few say they drink more alcohol because of the card. So I stand with those 25%. I'm not going to have that ripped away from them. I'm going to stand for the 22% who said that they report reducing the number of times that they drink and the number of episodes of heavy drinking. I'm not going to have that ripped away from them. I will stand with those 22%. And it doesn't mean that the other 78% are drinking more and more frequently. That's not the case at all. They're not. We know that there's a positive change in gambling behaviours. 21% of addicted gamblers have said that the card has created a positive change. 35% of that 21% said it helped in gambling for themselves, but more importantly, 43% in relation to their extended family, 38% in relation to their friends, 60% in relation to what gambling's going on in their community. I won't have that ripped away from them. There's no one gambling more because of this card. I'm not going to let those people down. Over 40% of CDC participants say they feel safer. I'm not going to have that ripped away from them. 20% of cashless debit card participants say that they've found that they've been able to reduce illicit drug use, one of the most addictive things there are. And they report that it's reducing. I can't find any other program around the country that does that. And if it exists, I'll roll it out next to the card. Complementary, as a partnership approach. But fundamentally, we needed a way to stop the fanning of the fire and the supply of the cash that was creating this problem. 45% of respondents report that the cashless debit card had improved things for themselves in general times most of the time. It's about half the community. And the other half reported things didn't change much. I'm not going to rip it away from that 45%. And we look at the initial evaluation, that was 2 years ago. 41% reported drinking less alcohol, 37% binging less frequently. These are extraordinary numbers and they need to be recognised in this place. 48% gambling less back in 2017. 40% of parents said they could look after their children better. I'm not going to rip that away from that 40%. 45% said they were saving money for the first time or better able to save money. There's no doubt the card does that. When a family goes in and finds more money than they can dream of on the card because the money isn't being spent in some of these other restricted areas. Merchants themselves reinforce this, saying that there's increased purchases of baby items, food, clothing, shoes, toys and other goods. I will never stop a child being locked in the bathroom in faeces-covered nappies while their parents do drugs or alcohol. But I can certainly help these parents who report these massive changes. There's an increased motivation to find employment because our culture has had millennia to get used to alcohol and to realise that you can consume it so long as you can turn up to work the next day. But the moment you can't, there's a problem and there has to be some kind of intervention. Those sort of practices haven't had the time to permeate through every corner of the nation. One day they will, but in the meantime, we need to ensure that government transfers for income replacement aren't spent on unlimited grog. We're just saying that grog can't be more than a fifth of the household expenditure. Most close to my heart is the Australian Early Development Census. We do it every year, and prep teachers all around the country do it. These figures are extraordinary because up in Kununurra, where we saw in the Western Desert very few solutions to heavy alcohol consumption, the number of vulnerable kids reported by lacking 2 domains of progress fell significantly in Kununurra at the time of introducing the card. Significant improvements in social competence, emotional maturity, language, cognition, communication skills, general knowledge. I've lived in a community where it was endemic petrol sniffing and fecal alcohol syndrome, and we knew nothing that could make any difference to fetal alcohol syndrome. We had no solution. We couldn't even stop mums we could see were pregnant drinking alcohol all day, every day, with their child strapped in a stroller. The only opportunity there was to reduce in a remote community. There's no pub in the communities I'm talking about, member. There's no pub in the community I'm talking about. Children strapped in strollers all day under a tree, and we're trying to reduce the amount of money spent on alcohol, and the card has done it, absolutely and obviously. We've reviewed emergency food relief vouchers and the use of parcels in Ceduna. With 18 months of being placed on the card, around 1/6 of participants no longer needed or needed way less assistance in that area. I will not rip it away from those parents. From March 16 through to March 19, the 3-year period, unemployment rate across all 4 sites had fallen by at least 1% in the context of nothing ever having reduced unemployment before. We can see when we look at merchant data that these cards have a stabilising force and they assist participants in paying for essential items. To hear the Labor Party say that this card is a shame, when the reality shows that participants can actually pay for what they need to, is a source of not shame but pride. Administrative data shows us that there's been over $2.8 million of alcohol that would have been purchased that hasn't been, thanks to the card, and that includes gambling products, and it's a significant reduction in alcohol sales, and obviously they would have gone ahead without the card. Now, since the COVID supplement in March this year, it was a very interesting natural experiment. Around $10 million has been spent within supermarkets and grocery stores, a huge jump, but what has it been spent on is the question. About 1.2 million of that has been spent on clothes and shoes, and a lot of that for children. I will not rip it away from those families. But before you can suggest that this is just about more cash flowing through a community, there's evidence also of an increased spending on recreational goods and appliances. Examples would include TVs, PlayStations and other recreational equipment. But for the first time, families that could barely live, as the previous speaker said, between payment fortnights, are in a position now to buy recreational and other retail elements that could never be afforded before. What I am saying will infuriate urban Labor MPs who are utterly out of touch with the conditions in remote Australia. They flew in a Cessna, they flew out that afternoon and they spoke to the 2 people who were annoyed by the cashless debit card and were reinforced and brought it back here. The Labor Party's arguments in this chamber about shame, about the punitive nature of the card, characterising it as racist and calling it shameful and costly, is one of the most disappointing elements of this debate. We can have this debate, and the card is not everything, but the card is something. The card has done its job clearly by evaluation. And in the context of remote Australia, where these are some of the hardest and most perennial and ingrained problems, maybe these solutions will be intergenerational. But I finish where I started, with these massive numbers of people who have ameliorated behaviour, reduced gambling, drinking, been able to feed, support and educate their children for the first time. I will not walk away from you.